Wilson. I'm one of the associate directors for the Social and Behavioral Sciences Core for the Duke Center for AIDS Research. And welcome to our January CFAR Social and Behavioral Sciences Core Rocket Talk. This is our little play on words with Rocket Talks. We used to have Chalk Talks, but we started doing them over Zoom. No chalk is involved, but we thought rockets sounded pretty zoomy. So we've been having a scientific communication series the last few months. We've focused on a number of different important areas in scientific communication, and you can get in touch with us for the recordings for those previous sessions. Today, we're really excited to have two experts to give us some feedback on policy communication, which is a crucial part of the scientific process that a lot of times we may not necessarily pay enough attention to or may leave out entirely. So we have about an hour up until noon, and I'm going to introduce our two speakers who will speak to us for a bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as well. So I'll first introduce Senator Graig Meyer. Senator Graig Meyer was elected to the North Carolina Senate this past November 2022, and previously he had been a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives since 2013, where he represented House District 50 and served constituents in portions of both Orange and Caswell counties. His legislative committee assignments included alcoholic beverage control, appropriation, K-12 education, homeland security, military and veteran affairs, and regulatory reform. And Senator Meyer has held founding and leadership positions with a diverse group of legislative caucuses and has been chosen to participate on a variety of boards. Additionally, as a trained social worker, Senator Meyer approaches legislation with an eye toward protecting those who are marginalized, vulnerable, and/or oppressed, and he's received several awards for his legislative advocacy. Prior to becoming a legislator, Senator Meyer spent 16 years working in North Carolina's public school system. He continues to work with schools and youth-serving nonprofits as the co-founder and principal consultant with the Equity Collaborative LLC. Thanks for joining us, Senator Meyer. And we also have Jenni Owen here. Jenni Owen is the director of the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships, or OSP. She was appointed by Governor Cooper to this new role within our state's government. Owen leads efforts to identify and launch strategic partnerships among state government, universities and colleges, philanthropy, and other entities. The North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships focuses on deepening partnerships among government, researchers, and philanthropy to increase internal government capacity to generate and use evidence in policy and practice. The Office of Strategic Partnerships team works with government and non-governmental partners on priority policy issues. The team develops and convenes networks of public sector research and philanthropy experts and provides a range of learning and engagement opportunities for stakeholders across sectors. Thank you so much for joining us, Director Owen. Without further ado, I wanted to open the floor to our two speakers to share some with us, and then I believe that we'll have some questions for you all as well. Does one of you care to open the floor?
I think that I am going first.
All right, thanks.
Sadie, thanks for hosting. Thanks to Amy and Danielle for helping pull all this together. It's an honor to be here. This is a good topic to have, and I think I'm really happy to be here with Jenni because she and I have worked on this topic together even before I was in the legislature and before she was in the governor's office. So it's fun for us to reconnect here and talk about this. And we have a lot of overlapping beliefs and experiences, but also I think some perspectives that complement each other well. And so you'll hear a little bit of different perspective from us. I wanted to talk about how I believe that when you're talking to policymakers and trying to impact policymakers about how you have to have story that goes along with facts and research. And that's specifically that often because of the way that our jobs work and the way that policymakers make decisions, that it's often stories and things that are more emotional or belief-based that open the door before you can bring in the research, the facts, et cetera, that they can use to make good decisions. And it's important to understand two elements of this. Part is about what our jobs are and why our jobs make that so, and part is just understanding, I think, the basics of human psychology and communication patterns. But for me as a state legislator, I am working on policies across a huge variety of areas. So if you heard a little bit of readout of my committee assignments, but even beyond what's before us in committee, we have to be prepared to talk about and vote on just about any bill that's before us. And I came into this out of the field of education with a deep knowledge of public education and policy and strategy, but realized quickly that having been an education administrator and an educator myself, I knew a lot more about what are the small levers that you move to change what happens in a school and how school leadership works, rather than the big levers of how do you change policy. And so I had to learn a different approach to thinking about education and how you move those big levers. And then I realized I can't be a single item specialist. I have to be able to think about all these things, about how do elections work, about public health, about criminal justice and all kinds of legal stuff that I had no exposure to. And I could go on and on and on. But I also had to learn that my job is really only 3 activities, and one of them more than others. And the 3 activities are talking to people, reading things, and writing things. And talking to people is probably 80% of it. There's so many people to talk to, so many meetings, so much information to be conveyed directly, whether those people be colleagues of mine who are other legislators, whether they be advocates or lobbyists, or whether they be content experts like yourself, whether they be constituents. I'm talking to people all the time, all of whom are giving me their opinion and maybe sometimes some facts on what it is that they want me to be focused on or to do or to vote on, et cetera. And when I do get a chance to read, it's pretty limited. I would love a chance to read in more depth about all of the policies that I want to work on. But because there's so many things that come before us, I really don't get the chance to dive into deep research or read books or thinkers, et cetera. And I remember when I was getting my master's in social work, I had a policy class that we had to write all of our papers in 2-page policy briefing format. And I thought that was so restrictive by the professor. And now I realize the utility of it, that a great 2-page memo is incredibly effective with me. But the truth is, I don't have enough time to read a lot of 2-page memos either. I get a lot of things that are in half-page or even quarter-page format from advocates that is just boiled down to like, here's what you want to know. I remember hearing a story that when Ronald Reagan would make decisions, he would have somebody bring him an index card with all the pros on one side and all the cons on the other side. And at the time, I thought it was an example of why Reagan was such a terrible president, that he would make presidential level decisions with that little information. And now I'm in a situation where occasionally I'm like, can I just have the index card version of this, please? Because I have to make a decision on how to vote, but I don't have enough time to do more in-depth work. Now, where I do have more time to do more in-depth work is on the bills that I'm actually working on, the ones that I'm writing, the ones that I'm co-creating with others, the ones that I'm trying to figure out what is the pathway, not just for what does this legislation look like, but how do I get this legislation passed? Because I can't do it myself. I have to get a majority of my colleagues. And that's one of the rare occasions where I actually spend time writing, is either in writing the actual bill or in writing communication to others. Maybe it's a newspaper column that I'm writing to try to build public support for my idea, or maybe it's an email just to my colleagues to say, hey, this is something I'm working on. Would you be willing to talk more with me about it? But out of the 3, writing is the one that I do the least. And so the majority of the time that I have to work on policy issues is spent in interpersonal human communication. And so then that's where it brings in the idea of story, is when I have very little time for most communication, and you want to have an impact with me, you're much more likely to have an impact when you capture me with a story than when you capture me with a fact or figure. Now, occasionally there's a fact, figure, research finding that captures me, but then I generally want to know, okay, well, what's behind that, right? And so that's the story of, why are you working on this? Why is this important? Who does this impact, et cetera? The stories that are related to that thing. And in human psychology, and this I came to learn through my social work understanding, that persuasion generally happens by attaching to people first through their emotions or through their belief systems, kind of what you have in your gut, so your heart or your gut, and then filling in the rationale for why that's important to you with your intellectual thought process. Now, I understand that not all researchers work this way, that you all are maybe wired that you're a little bit more with intellect first. But if you think maybe outside of your research, you may find that this is true for you in other parts of your life as well. And so when I'm approaching, this isn't just advice for you, but this is how I do it. When I'm approaching colleagues of mine to try to figure out, can I get them to support an idea that I'm working on, I'm often thinking about what is the story, the connection that I can make with them in order to make them want to hear more from me and be more engaged with me. And if I can grab them with that, then even if we have partisan differences, even if we've disagreed on other bills in the past, we may be able to find common ground because it started more on that emotional level. And so in your world of work in public health, and specifically, most of you are doing HIV research, right? Is that right? I think of a very important lesson about how public opinion and therefore public policy matters, and how it impacted public health around HIV, which is about the way that the gay rights movement built itself up in San Francisco under the leadership of Harvey Milk. And I'd encourage you to study that, if you haven't, to think about what are the roots of how do we move people's opinions about the field you're in, but also about topics that they haven't necessarily come to grapple with, no matter how important the topic is. Because if you jump ahead in that story, if you jump ahead from the roots of it to when the AIDS crisis really hit full-blown epidemic, there was a lot of news about the facts of how many people were being hit by AIDS, what the terrible situations were that they were being put into, lots of knowledge that it was a crisis, but not lots of willingness to actually take significant action on the crisis, because being gay was still such a taboo. But in the roots of that gay rights movement was Harvey Milk's emphasis that people who were gay should be out and should be proud and should tell their stories to everyone, to those people that they loved, to those people that they worked with, to those people in power. And it wasn't until more people realized that they knew gay people and they loved gay people that we saw significant policy change happen on the HIV and AIDS front, and then even another swing later on the policy front, where the United States moved towards a place of legalizing gay marriage because people knew the stories, because they knew people who they loved. And without that type of connection first, then the importance of, well, what should we do? What do we know about this virus? How much would it cost? All the things that we have to decide to make good policy, the doors weren't even open to those conversations until the connections in the human stories were there first. I think that's probably a good place to hand it off to Jenni, because what she specializes in so many ways is then figuring out, okay, so now that the door is open, how do you bring what people need to know to make the good policy decisions? So hopefully that's a good handoff to you, Jenni, and I will send it over to you.
Great handoff. Thank you. Happy to be here doing this with you. Apologize if I call you either Greg or Representative Meyer and not your current title, since it's newish. But what I'd like to do, I think, is two things. One, to invite anybody who's comfortable turning on their cameras to do that. I would love to see you slightly in more real life if you're able and willing. If not, no worries at all. And the other is just to pause for a minute to see if anyone has questions for Senator Meyer, so that if you have those top of mind, I'm happy to pause and do some quick back and forth for clarification if that works for everybody, and then do my piece and go back to another discussion, but happy to handle this however our leaders want to do that. So why don't we do that? Raise your hand, I guess. I'm not sure how we're handling it. I don't see anything in the chat yet. I know we're both very happy to have anybody put anything in the chat at any time, and we can try to track it. But I'll pause for a minute and let people ask questions of Senator Meyer to start, if you have any.
I think we do have a question from Dr. Ferrari.
Hello, Dr. Ferrari.
Hi, Senator Meyer. Yes, I am mute. Just to point out the fact that communicating by empathy is probably the best way to gather the attention of the other people. But there is also another component, I think, that stemmed out from some of the early advocacy for the people living with HIV at the time, that the stigma was probably at the highest. And this was the advocacy of other people who were probably in position either of public, aspect, let's say basketball players of renown, fame, actors, and everything else. And as you were saying, the empathy connected with them, that the whole thing kind of exploded. So where is the advocacy in all these this game? How much of the roles is going to play? How much? Not just for people living with HIV, but in general, in the medical field, how much of this is going to be important?
I love that question and that reminder, Dr. Ferrari, about how important that type of advocacy and storytelling was, right? So like, I think when you're mentioning athletes, like I think that there was a pivotal moment of Magic Johnson saying that he was HIV positive, right? So a huge cultural figure, someone who was perceived as very friendly, non-threatening, who was not gay. Like, I mean, there were so many elements of him as a specific figure and the way he handled it, right? I mean, I think he talked about it with a way that presented empathy towards everyone else who had HIV and allowed people to have a lot of empathy for him. But you also made me think of the flip side on the emotions, which was the ACT UP demonstrators, and how much emotional discomfort the ACT UP folks brought to the public by doing things that were considered to be radical, but so radical that they would break through from your intellectual thinking and down into to get you to question your emotions and beliefs of why would someone go to that lengths and why would they do such strange things. So kind of opening your mind to thinking in a new way because of that type of advocacy and activism. And so now, like, you have me wondering, and I don't have an answer for this. From what I know of those people who are on the Zoom, many of you are doing your research kind of with an eye towards other countries. And I don't know, how do you, like, what are the equivalent examples of how you get American policymakers, US decision makers, particularly probably those in Congress that write the checks for the application of your research in foreign countries, how do you get them to care enough about what's happening in a country that they've never been to, haven't heard of, don't really have a personal connection to, or whatever? I don't, like, who is the figure? What are the advocates, the activism? I don't, maybe you all might have better answers than I do for that. And then I'll say, that I see the other questions in the chat too. I can try and address those quickly. So Holly says, should you try to slip your data into stories for policymakers, and how? I absolutely think yes. Like, I think that well done journalism combines story and figures and research, right? And I mean, there are certainly times where well done journalism brings the attention to policymakers and where it opens the door for researchers to have direct conversation to policymakers. And another thing I don't know about you all is I don't know how often you're talking to policymakers directly, but like David's question is, can I give you an example of a very well done brief? And I don't have one in front of me, and maybe I can think of one or try and find one, but I'm going to my legislative office tomorrow on Wednesday. And there are often times where my assistant hands me a bunch of materials and I go through them, and 90% of that materials, it goes straight into the recycling. I know what this is, nothing new, boom, 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 boom. And then I'll grab something and I'll be like, oh, this is interesting. Look what they did here. Look at the way they captured this story, or they grabbed my attention, or whatever it is. I'll show it to my legislative assistant. Sometimes it means we take action on it. Sometimes it just means that it stopped me for a minute. But that power of stopping me for a minute means you have my attention. You have my thinking in a way that other stuff didn't. But I'll try and get back to you about that, David. And Ronald, I see your question about trust and distrust with medical stuff. And certainly in the wake of the pandemic and so much misinformation, there is a lot of distrust among policymakers. And a lot of skepticism. I would say I think it's highly partisan. Like, I think the Republicans exhibit a lot more distrust than we do on the Democratic side. I think we have our own fallacies on the Democratic side, which I can get into. But again, like to you, I mean, I think you answer your own question that you have to open the door with vignettes and stories, and then give people the data that backs up their newly open thinking. Because if they're in environments where they have to be talking to people who share their distrust or their skepticism or their misinformation, then you have to have an approach for giving them, first of all, like the new story that they're telling, and then secondly, the ammunition that they need to be able to explain and to verify for other people why they're approaching something in the way that they haven't.
Am I grabbing the mic back from you now?
I think so. Oh, I guess. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry, if you're perusing the
Sorry.
questions. Yeah.
Norman, I see I conflated your question with David. I'll fix that for you. And David asked urgency. Yeah. I mean, David's right about urgency is a great point. Like, urgency makes it a lot easier to tell an emotionally compelling story. And there's a lot of policy issues we work on that don't have a high degree of public urgency. And that's where I think individual stories still make a difference. Like, I think that was one of the earliest things that I learned that was disconcerting to me in the legislative world, and particularly in education. Like, in my field of expertise, I would see education policy leaders, like a committee chair, a bill sponsor, or somebody, give a singular story to justify why they're going to change statewide policy. And they'd say, well, one student or one teacher in my district told me this. And I would sit there and say, that story is like in opposition to the thousands of students that I've worked with over the course of my career. But because you met one person who told you that story, and because you have the power to move that bill, you're going to make statewide policy based on that singular story. So that's a negative example, but you can use that as a positive example as well in areas that don't have the same sense of public urgency. If you can make a connection of saying, look, here's this one individual case. I'll give you a good example of this. The first bill that we ever passed in North Carolina towards marijuana legalization was a bill that legalized the use of CBD for children with epilepsy. And that bill came into effect almost exclusively because of one child and her parents advocating to one legislator, and then that legislator using their power to legalize CBD for childhood epilepsy. And now I'll pass it back over to Jenny. Thank you, Jenny.
Of course, thank you. And I was scrambling to copy and paste links to a couple of series of briefs that I think are pretty strong, but I will save that and mention them and do that afterwards. It's hard. I think I'm smiling not only at what Senator Meyer was talking about, but also at your questions about, slipping in data So just to react to that immediately and quickly, our hope, I think, jointly is that you don't have to slip it in and hope nobody notices, but that you can include it very proactively in a way that will work and be useful and received, openly. And this isn't a talk, but what I shared ahead of time was that my title, I think really compliments Senator Meyer. I'm just going to call you Graig for now, even though I know this will be online, and I apologize for anyone who says I shouldn't have done that.
Greg, it's fine.
Given where we all work, government wants and uses research too, and that's really true. And a lot of what your questions are asking, and I think highlighting, want me to say back and to answer in partial response, and I'll talk a little bit about what I do in our office in just a minute, is it's not a question of do we want it, can we use it? And when I say we, I'm thinking executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch as well, at all levels of government, so local, state, and federal. And obviously everything I say doesn't apply equally, but I think it really does truly apply at every level of government and in every branch of government. It's a question of how we get it, when we get it, definitely the messenger. Is the timing right? And one of you put a comment in there about urgency. So absolutely, the timing matters a lot. Sometimes it's too soon, sometimes it's too late, sometimes it's just the right time. So a lot of considerations that I think you, in your roles, to the extent that I know about your roles and who you are, have probably more control over than you think, and opportunities to engage with your data and research and evidence in ways with people in government that will make a difference, I would say, sort of more than you think. Now, many of you probably have a ton of experience, and we could hand the mic over to you and you could talk about your experiences with having success in engaging between research and government. So I would love to have an opportunity to do that, so you can share with each other and ask questions of each other if there's time. I'm going to read just a few, very quickly, literally sentences that I have received in some form from people in research. And I was at Duke for a long time at the Sanford School before I took a leave to join the current administration. And so I know very well the challenges of sitting inside a research institution and wanting very much to engage with a non-research institution to have an impact on programs and policy, and have really worked a lot. South Africa, I'm glad somebody mentioned South Africa. Sorry to be pulled over the chat. I was actually going to mention South Africa as well, where I have a lot of colleagues who do this very, very well. I can point you to a couple examples there too. So thanks for mentioning that. So a couple of things. This is what I get a lot, and I think Senator Meyer, you probably too do as well, versions of this. So one is, here's a link to my journal article that I thought might interest you. That was from a colleague at Duke who very kindly wanted to share her journal article that, like you, Senator Meyer, I was never going to read, and even less likely to send it to my colleagues in the Health and Human Services Department and send them a link to a journal article. Can say more about that. I don't need to talk with people in government because I use publicly available data. That was an interesting comment that I thought was somewhat concerning, and tried to work with a person who said that, not at Duke, at another institution, to help them understand why, even if they are using only publicly available data, why talking with people in government would be quite beneficial, not only to them, but to us. And the third is, let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I get that all the time, which I greatly appreciate. And I often respond by saying, I don't know, because I don't know what you can do to help. I don't know what you do. I don't know what's motivating that question. So how can I help you learn more about what we need, so that you can then approach us more directly and say, here's what I think I can do to be helpful. I will also say, though, that I very much believe that the responsibility for doing this more and better, this by sort of bridging the work across sectors more and better and well, is not at all only for the researchers and research institutions. And I know some of you are from RTI and other entities, but a really, truly a two-way street. And there's a lot we can do inside government to make it easier for you. There's a lot you can do inside research institutions to make it easier and more impactful for us. So I really, truly see this as a partnership opportunity, or a series of partnership opportunities that we can, again, leverage and increase to have a positive impact. So I think what I'd like to do, just so that I don't ramble and keep myself on task here, is, Jenni, I think and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I haven't said it out loud, I realize. Great. If you could just put up the slides. I'm going to run through these very quickly, just for awareness for all of you that this information exists. I hope you'll share it with everybody afterwards. Danny and others, and then go back just to share a few specific examples that I mentioned a minute ago that I hope will help for a discussion for the last half of our time together. So you can go to the next slide. So some of this you kindly read as you were doing the introductions, but just to help you focus a little bit on what the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships does, we're housed within the Office of State Budget and Management, OSBM. That might seem odd. It's actually a great place for something like this to be housed, because the Office of State Budget and Management works with every agency within state government and the university system and a lot of quasi-governmental agencies, and the community college system and so on. And of course, it's very much involved with the budgeting process, both development and execution, which in itself reflects a lot about how decisions are made, what information is taking in for decision making and so on. And of course, works with the legislature and takes direction from the legislature in many ways. I would just point out for you on this slide here that we strive for partnerships that are scalable, sustainable, and develop public open source resources. So we really emphasize the importance and value of government sharing information from research that is publicly available, and research partners, whether in or outside of government, sharing information both internal to ourselves across agencies and with other research partners, and happy to say more about that. I won't say a lot about our work with philanthropy, but the point there, and again, for your awareness, is an observation that some of us had sort of early in this administration. It's certainly not specific to this administration, that philanthropy generally doesn't know, many exceptions, doesn't know about government. And people in government generally, also with exceptions, don't know a lot about what happens in philanthropy. While at the same time, the philanthropic sector in North Carolina, nationally and internationally, is increasingly interested in engaging with policy and practice, and increasingly doing work and making investments either directly in government or with government, or that have implications for program and policy. And so we've established a thread of work that really is integrated with our government research partnerships work that involves partners in philanthropy, not just for their money, and I mean that sincerely, but for their partnership and awareness and expertise and so on about what's happening in the world and where they make investments that have implications, again, for policy and practice. So you can go to the next. Yes, David, and get back to your question about encouraging public-private collaborations, but can talk about maybe more what your question stems from. I'm actually not gonna, this is sort of helping you understand how we're organized. There's some specific examples I'd point you to, but very briefly, we work with state agencies. So we're focused on state government for obvious reasons. We work with state agencies, and the Cabinet and Council of States. Don't presume you know exactly what that is or means, but happy to say more if helpful, or direct you to resources. But to identify areas for which they need research to make better decisions or get information that might inform decisions and so on. We then help that agency identify potential research partners, hopefully within North Carolina, because we have such an incredible array of research expertise across public and private colleges and universities and community colleges. We try not to go outside the state. We're not prohibited from doing that, and we don't object to doing that, but we start inside North Carolina to try to identify partners, and happy to tell you about that process. And then it's more than matchmaking. It's a lot more than matchmaking, but it includes a matchmaking effort. And again, I'll stop with that, and you can go to the next slide, but happy to say more about the operational approach if it's helpful. So thank you. I'll point here to just 3 examples that you might want to click on intentionally, both from 2 cabinet agencies, the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, where the Wildlife Resources Commission is housed, and the Department of Public Safety. And then the Department of Insurance, which is not a cabinet agency, that's a Council of State agency, meaning that the leader of that agency, the Commissioner of Insurance, is a statewide elected official. And I say that just to emphasize how much we work across government in different types of agencies. You can go to the next, if you'd like. So for consideration, if you're inside government, I just will point you again to these questions that we ask our agency partners to consider to help them figure out how this research partnership effort might be useful to them. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with the Federal Evidence Act. If you're not familiar with the Federal Evidence Act, I would strongly encourage you to just learn about it. Take a quick look at evaluation.gov. I'm saying that for my partners at USOMB, who would be happy for you to take a look at that. And you'll learn from there, if you're in the Evidence Act, there was a bipartisan piece of legislation at the federal level that requires federal agencies, many federal agencies, to develop something called learning agendas. That may be a very familiar term to some of you, may be completely unfamiliar to others of you, but we have worked to do something somewhat similar. There's not a requirement in North Carolina, but the idea is that we work with agency leaders and people deep inside the agencies, again, to identify what it is they want to know, why do they want to know it, why don't they have the answers that they need, and how can they go about getting those answers. So you can go to the next slide. And this will get me back to what we're talking about today. If you're outside government, and again, I imagine many of you have worked inside government, what are the issues and topics that you work on or plan to work on, or that you have expertise in that have relevance to government policy and or programs? My guess is many of you are saying, well, everything I work on has some relevance or implications for policy and program. That's great. It would not surprise me at all, given where you're all situated. But then my question, again, my follow-up question would be, who in government, or does anyone in government know that you're doing this? Did you talk with people in government at any step along the way? So even, I would say, well before you actually finish designing your research would be ideal. Happy to say why. And do you proactively try to learn about what people in government are focusing on and are planning to focus on? Hopefully some of you say yes to some of those. Some of you may say no to all of those. If you say no to all of those, I'd love to have a conversation about why that is and what you can do to make the answer to at least some of those be yes. And that again reinforces, like, why does it matter that you talk with people in government before doing research that has implications for government? I'll give you a very simple, real example, which is related to an interview protocol that colleagues at a university were doing related to food insecurity, and shared with us in government, Health and Human Services Department in particular, what they learned from those interviews. Was very interesting and relevant. And all we could think was, if only you had told us before you put that into the field about the 18 questions you were going to ask. There were 2 questions, or maybe it was 1, I don't know, it's not the point. There were just a couple of questions that if we'd known you were going to be asking all these people, all these really important things, we would have asked, could you please add those 2 questions to your protocol? And at a minimum, if you could have said to us ahead of time, we are designing an interview protocol, is there anything you'd like to know? For example, if you happen to be asking about 3-year-olds, but for whatever reason, 4-year-olds are really at the top of our issues of concern for a very good reason, why not either switch or add or adjust and so on to make it truly relevant to what government wants and needs at that time? You can do that, in my view, without ditching your own research agenda. I think often people say, well, if I'm going to be responsive to government, then I don't get to focus on fill in the blank that I have studied so hard and worked so hard to become an expert on. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, and I think often they are very much mutually, integratable and beneficial. So you can go to the next, I think maybe the last slide, sorry.
I think this might be the last slide.
Oh, okay. Well, there should be a page of resources at the very end. Maybe that's what you're looking at. There should be one page of resources. Yeah,
there
perfect.
it is.
Okay, sorry. Yep. So those are resources that I hope will be helpful to you. If you don't mind, just for 1 minute there, if this works, if you could click on the second bullet there, the North Carolina Project Portal. That will just take you to an online tool, which I know is something you were asking about ahead of this discussion, an online tool that we developed where we work with agencies. And if it doesn't work, you can certainly go to it directly, and I can just describe it briefly. It's an online resource that we developed where you can go, if you Google North Carolina Project Portal, you'll find it yourself, and it'll show you current examples of, and both sort of open, in progress, and completed. There you go. Thank you very much. Examples of state agency requests for research involvement and assistance that we then put out into the world to try to find research partners to help answer. The whole array of different types of projects. Some of them are thoroughly what I would call through and through research projects. Some of them are less traditional research projects, but I'll give you an idea. I mean, you're welcome to contact us. I'll put the general email in the chat before we're done. You're welcome to contact us to make sure that you get notifications of any of these, or any of these in particular that come up in the future. So you can pull down the PowerPoint. Appreciate that very much. And then I'm just going to close with a few very specific ways that I always encourage people to get more informed about what government cares about. And then I'll stop and look back and see what's in the chat, and we can talk with Senator Meyer as well about anything you'd like to discuss for the rest of the time. So back to here's a link to my journal article that I thought might interest you conundrum. I think it's fair to say, at least in my experience, it's fair to say, most people I know whose primary role is conducting research that's policy and or practice relevant don't actually ever even do that, right? So kudos to that colleague for saying, I have a journal article that I think might interest you. The reason I wasn't going to click on it and was definitely not going to forward it to anyone else was because I had no idea how much, I didn't know what it was about. And she may have said something about it's, let's just say food insecurity again. But she certainly didn't say why she thought we might care. Didn't say if she knew or thought it might have any implications for current or recent or upcoming policy or program decision making. And so the effort, it kind of back to what Craig was saying, and I wrote down, when I have time to read, which is a way of saying don't have a lot. I was not going to forward that on to somebody and say maybe somewhere buried in these 45 pages is a nugget for you to consider in your future decision making, but maybe not. So I went back to her, which I wouldn't expect us to do. And I certainly wouldn't expect Senator Meyer to say, like, thank you so much for the link. Could you now follow up with 3 bullets that matter? That's not a reasonable expectation. I did in this case. I tried to do it. I'm sure you do too, Greg. And I just wrote back and said, great, congratulations. A nice version of why should I care? Or could you tell me of 1 or 2 or 3 things I'd like to pass this on to my colleagues at Health and Human Services, but why might this be relevant? And she did. So kudos to her, she did. But you can't expect that type of exchange to happen. It more likely will go into the virtual or real recycle bin, as he was saying before. And so one thing I strongly encourage that I don't really think is difficult is to share the why should I care, not only up front when you're sharing the deliverables and the final products, but much earlier on. And so my sort of plea is don't wait till you're done. Even if you didn't ask for the the interview protocol input before you finished your research design, you can still share along the way. We're 6 months into our 3-year project. Here's some early findings. I completely appreciate that there are things you can't share until the research is complete, but you can share something often, or at least let us know this research is underway and that you think it's going to have implications for us at the end. That also gets us familiar with, I'm just looking at who's right in the center of my screen. So Sarah Mosier, I hope I pronounce your name. If that person is doing work and I continuously see that name or the name of the project, then when it's done, I might say, oh, that's that thing that they have kindly been telling me is underway for the last 2 years. Sounds familiar. That's a messenger that has tried to inform me. Now they're sharing findings. Here's why they think I might care. That's number 1. Number 2, and actually another specific thing I would recommend people do is get on the press release. And this is something for your students in particular, probably, or potentially more as much as for you. Get on the press release list. Greg has heard me say this a million times. Get on the press release list for the agencies or divisions or offices or departments or whatever it is that do the work that is most relevant to your research. So I can't tell you that the Division on AIDS Research or Division on AIDS Policy, for example, at HHS in the state government has an actual press release list for that office, but certainly the Health and Human Services Department does. And certainly there are, again, press release lists at the federal level and internationally that speak to your issue. If you're not already, and I don't mean listservs, I mean literally the press release lists. And that is where you hear about grant funding, you hear about new appointments to new offices, you hear about problems, you hear about legislation, et cetera. You know what I'm referring to. And that's really a great way to find out what a department, again, division, agency, leader, and so on cares about. The second one, just very quickly, I don't need to talk with people in government because I use publicly available data. The problem with that was that the person I'm referring to was trying to figure out why people in government didn't read her stuff. She knew they didn't, or they didn't ask her for more input than just sort of reading her articles potentially, but probably not. Turns out she was using a term that is not the same term we use inside government that she was using in her research, even though her research was highly, highly relevant. So let's just take the word, credential and certificate. there might be a very technical meaning of each of those words inside a particular policy or area or something like that. If you're using the word credential and you're talking about how Senator Meyer and his team, if they could only change the credentialing process for fill in the blank, and he's thinking about it from a certification process for the same thing, he might just not even read further, not because he thinks it's wrong, but it may not be relevant to what he's doing. So knowing what the term is or the terms are that people that you're trying to have an influence on or effect on, or even just educate, use, could mean everything. And if this person had one conversation with the agencies that she was writing about, just one, I can almost guarantee that her work would have been seen and potentially even used as much, much more relevant to their policy and program decision-making. And then the last one is just to let me know if there's anything I can do to help. That one I highlight a lot because I am so grateful for people in any sector who proactively reach into government to say, let me know what I can do to help. It's a lot of work to figure out how to answer that question often. And we all know how hard it is. You know, somebody looking for a house, but you don't know when someone's selling a house at the right time or whatever the example might be. It's the same idea. And so anything you can do to help educate us about what you do, who you are, what you know, efforts you've made in the past to engage with people in government that can help us get more up to speed on what it is you can do to help or who we might share your offer with to help further goes a long way towards having that conversation be productive and fruitful. So I've probably gone on too long. I'm going to mute myself and take a look at the chat. And what I might do is let someone else, I'm happy, Amy and Jenni, to pull from the chat myself and pick a question or two, or I'm happy to mute myself and let you drive that.
I'm happy
also to answer
take
other
a look at
questions
the chat.
too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem.
Sadie, I can answer your question while you look at the chat if you want, or you're going to get somebody else first.
There was one other person who had a question before me, so I was hoping David Palm was asking about public-private collaborations and clarified the question was coming from an example of government-industry collaborations involving basic and clinical research towards a cure for HIV. So harnessing expertise from both groups, as well as providing access to technology and intellectual property belonging to industry. So how NCOSP might be a part of that process or involve government in that process. David, was there anything else you wanted to clarify in the question?
Yeah, I'll just speak to that. I'll speak to that quickly. So the short answer is we don't focus, when you say public-private, as I think you mean truly corporate, as you say there. So we don't focus on corporate only because we're new-ish, we're small, there's so much need for this engagement with universities specifically and non-corporate research institutions. But we certainly are supportive of it and want what you're describing to happen. And it does happen. There have also been traditionally, I don't know if you agree, but more existing paths to engagement between corporate and government, often for different reasons. I think of something like the Economic Development Partnership or something like that, which is not specific to what you're referring to. So I would be happy if that question is motivated in part by maybe I want this to happen and I've tried and it's not, or I've tried to get inroads somewhere and I'm not succeeding. You know, I'm happy to have an offline conversation with you just in the interest of time to see if there's some way I might be able to help connect you with others who focus more probably at the Department of Commerce. It just depends a little bit, maybe at HHS. It depends, I think, more specifically on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So I feel like that was a half answer, but I hope it was helpful.
Sadie, on your question, you asked about how can you figure out how your priorities as a researcher would align with priorities of certain policymakers. And I love that question, in part because, like, oh my God, it's a nearly impossible task for you, right? Because there's too many policymakers and it's too hard to decipher what we're actually, like, you could look at my list of bills. People email me all the time and they're like, I really want to talk to you about this bill. It's so important to me. Here's my personal story. And I'm like, oh, I'm the fourth sponsor on that bill. Like, I signed on because they wanted somebody from the central part of the state. Like, it's not a personal passion project of mine, right? Like, I'm on there for some other strategic reason. But there are people who are employed to know the answer to that question, who are lobbyists. And lobbyists have a very negative label and reputation to much of the public, and sometimes for very good reasons. And I hope never to become a lobbyist, but my appreciation for lobbyists has grown dramatically since I've been in the legislature, because we honestly couldn't do our job without them. Like, they are the transmitters of the majority of information that we have. And good lobbyists are really valuable, not just to me as a legislator, but to the constituencies that they serve. And so I would think about who are the lobbyists that are connected to what you care about, or connected to your work. So starting close to home, if you're at a university, your university employs lobbyists. So how can you or your department request a meeting with the university lobbyists and say to them, like, we really want to have this impact on policymakers. Who can you connect us to? They have lobbyists both at the state level, the federal level, et cetera. And then I think also, kind of to the point about corporate partners, thinking about if you are working in an area with corporate partners, like if you're working with HIV drug manufacturers, they sure as heck have lobbyists. They probably have a lot of lobbyists. And how do you work with them to make sure that your research is part of what they're presenting to the people that they're talking to? And my guess is that I got a message from my friend Abby, who kind of acknowledged, and I get this, like how Jenni and I are talking to you about domestic side work, and if you're working internationally, some of this will apply, but not all of it. But my guess is that the same process would have to be true internationally. Like, who are your partner organizations that have connections to the international policy decision makers? And how do you just build a relationship with those people whose job it is to stay on top of which policymakers really need to hear from you, so that you don't have to keep in touch with all of us as individuals? Because if I am working with a lobbyist, from even a corporate lobbyist from who I trust them, and they say, Representative Meyer, I'd really like you to meet with this Duke researcher because I know you're passionate about HIV care, and this person has some stuff that I think would be really interesting to you, I will likely do it.
Thank you. And it looks like we had some other comments in the chat about public and private partnerships from David and Wendy.
Yeah, I'll just add, and I think David's the one who said he's in a noisy place and doesn't want to go off mic, or on mic, which I appreciate your saying that. I think, despite what I said about our focus on government, sort of more traditional research institution partnerships, and I include RTI and so on, and is our focus is on, like, what I would call cross-sector partnerships. And so if there's a corporate partner that has the ability, opportunity, interest, by all means, sort of bring them in. So if we were searching, if you go to that project portal and you see an example of a project and you think, well, I'm part of a solution here, but it would be so much better with these corporate partners, absolutely great. I think it is more that we know there are there's so much research currently underway right now across North Carolina that is relevant to North Carolina state government. And of course, I include the legislature when I say that we don't even know exists. And there are questions that are keeping our leadership, agency leadership and legislators and others up at night that you don't know they're asking. That what we're trying to do is in particular is focus on connecting those dots. So that was not, so I hope, and then David, you're nodding, so I appreciate that. I hope that makes more sense in terms of what our focus is. It is not, we're not as interested in a corporate partner as we are in a university partner. The other challenge is, none of us have talked about funding for this work. I'll say this on recorded, intentionally on a recorded line here, our Office of Strategic Partnerships is not currently embedded for the long term in North Carolina state government. I hope it will be, and it's not about preserving my job. And so people who haven't worked with us before don't know the evolution of this office. We need to encourage investment to secure that this work continues beyond the current administration, not because it's politically driven, because, as I said, we work across agencies and branches and so on, but because it's a new thing. And so for people who just assume we're here forever, I actually think it's a good thing that we reassess and see if that should be the case, but there are assumptions that we are. And so that's, again, where we've been partnering with philanthropy and across levels of government and branches of government and so on to make sure that we can embed it in a way that's lasting, you know, for both the benefit of the researchers and benefit of the agency leaders and decision makers. I would say one other quick thing that Graig mentioned, lobbyists, and I would maybe broaden that, but maybe, you know, feel free to disagree, broaden that sort of intermediaries in general. So the goal, the expectation here, in my view, isn't that you all, you know, that every researcher becomes really, really good at engaging with people in the policy realm. I think actually there are some people that that just aren't good at that, and that's okay. There are other people who are paid to do that, like wake up every single day. And I don't use the word translation because I think that reinforces that we're speaking different languages. My hope would be that we actually get to the point that we're speaking similar languages in this type of work. There are people I know in your department and elsewhere, like whose full-time job is to do this bridging work to some extent or communicate the research that you're producing. And that's not to disparage how well they're doing in their full-time jobs, but use them, I would say, you know, for the type of work that we're describing as well, not just in a lobbying respect, but in a, you know, how do you get your information to people who can use it in a time and a manner that you can use it sort of more regularly and more often, and not just waiting till the deliverable is complete, as I was saying before. But I feel like I should be quiet, and you may not want to wrap us up in some way or finish with some last.
Thank you all so much. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there was one more comment or question, but we are at the top of the hour. So we're going to close things out. I did want to remind everyone that Jenni had mentioned specifically that the Office of Strategic Partnerships does have the capability of having some consultation, limited consultation. There's structures set up for that. Also wanted to remind everyone that the Duke CFAR Social and Behavioral Sciences Core does have consultations for new projects, and we don't have expertise in finding a lobbyist that you can work with or finding a policymaker or government entity that you can work with, but we are able to help make those connections. So if we don't know, then we can help you find what you need to get what you want done. So just a reminder, Social and Behavioral Sciences Core is here, and it looks like Jenni put some contacts in the chat as well, and we'll be sending out some information after this training as well. So if you all wouldn't mind joining me in thanking our two speakers, Senator Meyer and Director Owen, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate all of the wisdom and guidance that you've offered for us. Oh, and in the chat, Duke Government Relations. Those are the Duke lobbyists?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep. They're great people. Yep. And RTI has a team as well. They're great.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that, Graig. Doug Heron and Chris Simmons and others, to be specific, who cut across both the medicine and university realms, right, Graig? So absolutely. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that before too.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're a great team. Thanks for having us, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a great week, everyone.